G.N. Devy is an Indian literary critic and former professor. He was a professor of English at the Maharaja Sajrao University of Baroda from 1980 to 1996. He writes in three languages: Marathi, Gujarati, and English. He has written and edited close to 90 books in areas including literary criticism, anthropology, education, linguistics, and philosophy. So, in this essay, J.N. Devi points some of the major difficulties in following Western criticism on literary translation and also discusses translation theory, keeping in view the Indian perspective practice of literary translation. G.N. Devi quotes Haley Miller's statement: translation is the wandering existence in a perpetual exile. The statement alludes to the biblical might of the fall, exile, and wandering. In ensconced in the belief in the soul's perpetual transition from form to form may find it difficult to subscribe to the Western metaphysics of translation. The pre-structuralist basis of translation theory in the West has been metaphysical and owing to the institutionalized fear inspired by the might of Adam and Paradise, the literary tradition reared on Christian metaphysics have often same view translation as an intrusion of the other. The Indian consciousness, on the other hand, and in a crude manner of differentiating, is itself a translating consciousness. The act of shifting from one dialect to another, from one register of speech to another, of mixing two and three languages within the span of a single sentence does not seem unnatural. The extent to which bilingual literary production has been accepted in India as a normal literary behavior and the historical length of the existence of such practice are indicative of India's translating consciousness. India can boast of various imaginative methods of physical torture and mental persecution in its long history, but it has no martyrs to the cause of translation as Etienne Dolet in France, who was executed for attempting a rather free translation of Plato. A translation was heresy and protest not only during the Renaissance Europe, it was probably so for the first great philosopher of Europe, Plato. The Platonic objection to poetry was that it distorts reality while it translates things into verbal forms. As against him, Aristotle upheld the honor of poetry by saying that while it imitates reality, it does create aesthetically pleasing structures. The term mimesis, a prelinguistic translation in Jacobson's view, remained the central concept in his philosophy of creativity. Translation, indeed, is the crucial metaphor for creativity in Western literary thoughts. Uh, in times of profound social changes, Europe has often renewed its creativity by resorting to translation and returning the metaphor to or sorry to its origin of literary. The English and German translations of the Bible, which enriched these two languages so substantially, were such attempts. Um, if translation is a metaphysical enigma, it is yet a powerful political weapon. It is a means of appropriating power to oneself. The translations of the Bible were no mere literary exercises nor spiritual enterprises. They were obvious acts of political defiance. The political significance of translation can be evidenced in Indian tradition. The whole bhakti movement from Sanskrit uh, of poetry in India had the desire of translating the language of spirituality from Sanskrit to the languages of the people. However, translation as a political weapon is not always and necessarily employed towards reducing the gap between the divine and the profane, the high and the low. The translation enterprise during the period of Renaissance and the Enlightenment was of a diachronic nature. Its aim was to nativize in the European vernacular languages the ancient store of wisdom. That is how the Bible and Homer's poem received attention of translators in this period. The second great period of translation in modern Europe was of a synchronic nature. Its aim was to open up the cultural areas, mainly of the Orient, to Europe. The translations by Sir William Jones, H.E. Wilson, Edward Fitzgerald, and those attempted and encouraged in Germany by Goethe differed in orientation from the earlier translation of the Bible and Homer. While the Renaissance translations were attempts to raise the status of the translator's culture, the Romantic translations were aimed at uh, uh, the, raising the cultural status of the works translated. Their minimum requirement was to seem exotic without being essentially un-English and un-German. The third phase of European translation have been comparative in nature. Leaving aside the historical fact that European scholars in the Romantic and post Romantic period had created a three level hierarchy of literature, that is, anthropology, for literatures of the colonies with oral cultures, Orientalism, or the colonies with impressive cultural histories, and comparative literature for literatures of European countries. This third phase seems purely academic in nature. Goethe again had a great share in initiating the comparative phase of European translations. The modern European translations from contemporary integration of languages in the study of literary history. The main focus of these studies was a result of the 19th century philosophy of political nationalism. Uh, when translation was a rediscovery of the original, free translation was welcome. When translation became a means of turning the colonial world into an object of consumption, exotic but not foreign translations found demand. And when European nationalism encouraged academic comparatism, faithful translations acquired prestige. Uh, Though the common reader and the literary critic tend to look at a translated literary work as being less original than literature produced within one language, owing to its bilingual linguistic involvement, translation possesses highly complicated problems to the literary theorist. The most complicated and defeating problem is the question, what makes a good translation good? While it is also difficult to sort out such an issue in relation to poetry or fiction, there are at least some attempts to presume that aesthetics of literature can be related to some criteria as organic structure, relevant form, uh, complexity, or imagination. Over the centuries, most literary cultures seem to have settled the basic issue about literature in that no one raises any longer the question whether literature is meaning or mere expression. But with translation event, that issue is still undecided. It is still difficult to say whether the place of translations is in the literary history of the source language or that of the target language, or whether translation form an independent tradition by themselves. Since this ontological uncertainty haunts translation activity, much of the debate about translation revolves around a haphazard polarity. Unfortunately, for translation, various developments and monological data and situations. Roman Jacobson is an important name in the history of structural linguistics. In his essay on the linguistic of translation, he proposed a threefold classification of translations. Number one, those from one verbal order to another verbal order with the same language system. Number two, those from one language system to another language system. Number three, those from a verbal order to another system as signs. As he considers theoretically a complete semantic equivalence as the final objective of the Translation Act, which is not possible, he asserts that poetry is untranslatable. He maintains that only a creative transposition is possible. Modern semantics have devoted itself very vigorously to the discussion of synonymy and polysemy. It included that synonymy in a language will create redundancy, and since no language structure admits redundancy, synonymy is only a popular belief but not a scientific linguistic. Historical linguistics has some useful premises that throw light on this difference in order to explain linguistic changes. Historical linguistics employ the concept of semantic differentiation as well as that of the phonetic glides. While the linguistic changes within a single language occur along the line of semantic differentiation, they also show marked phonetic glides. Linguistic changes within a single language are predominantly of semantic nature. The linguistic differences between two closely related languages are predominantly phonetic. Structural linguistics considers language to be a system of signs artificially developed that tries to cover the entire range of significance available to the culture of that language. The signs do not mean anything by or in themselves. They acquire significance by virtue of their relation with
I think there is some issue with Richa, some problem.
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sir.
Go.
Yeah. Uh, this, theo- uh, this theory naturally looks offensive at translation, which is an attempt to rescue significance from one system of signs and to wed it with another such system. But language is an open system. It keeps admitting new signs as well as new significance in its fold. It is also open in the sociolinguistic sense that it allows an individual speaker to write to use as much of it as he likes. Uh, if translation is defined as some kind of communication of significance, and if we accept the structuralist principle that communication becomes possible because of translation, is possible because systems of verbal signs are open and vulnerable. The translating consciousness exploits the potential openness of a language system, and as it shifts significance from a given verbal form to a corresponding uh, but different verbal form, it also brings closer the materially different sign systems. The concept of translating consciousness and of communities of people possessing it are not mere notion. The most third world countries uh, where a dominating colonial language has occupied a privileged place, such communities do exist. In India, several languages are used as if this formed a continuous spectrum of signs and significance. Uh, Ferdinand, Ferdinand de Saussure is considered to be the founder of modern Western linguistics. One of the three major distinctions he postulated to describe language was that between parole and langue. The former is the language and used by the individual. The latter, the entire system of language as such. Saussure initiated discussions about the relation between the system of signs and use of signs. This distinction overlooks the interlingual dynamics of significance. Uh, at the time, Saussure proposed his new observation on the nature of language and linguistics. Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah, you are.
There are innumerable studies in the area of language acquisition and second language learning, but they are centered around the assumption that an inevitable chronological order or priority scale exists in language learning situation. This field of activity, what may seem in India, is very natural activity. It's stratified in terms of value-based indicators L1 and L2. In Chomsky's model of language acquisition, the concept of semantic consciousness treats the source language and translated language as parts of a larger and continuous spectrum of various intersecting systems of verbal signs. J.C. Catford presents a comprehensive statement of theoretical formulations about the linguistics of translation in his work, A Linguistic Theory of Translation, in which he seeks to isolate various linguistic level of translation. His basic premise is that since translation is a linguistic act and theory of translation must emerge from linguistic. Translation is an operation performed on languages, a process of substituting a text in one language for a text to another. Clearly, then, any theory of translation must draw upon a theory of language, a general linguistic theory. The general linguistic theories as they exist today are closely interlinked with developments in anthropology, particularly after Durkheim and Levi-Strauss. After Saussure and Levi-Strauss, linguistics started treating language with an anthropological curiosity. When linguistic branched off to its monolingual structuralist path, comparative literature persisted in its fate in translation. Translation study formed with the study of literary history and literary perception, a very important branch of comparative literature. Most of the comparative studies of literature are conventionally based on translation of works from languages or literatures compared. It is because of this background that a valuable concept of structure style has emerged in the field of comparative literature, in turn reaffirming the viability of translation. Comparatists believe that every literary movement has a specific nation style which is guided by native traditions, but it also has a transnational and transcultural style. The first, the first is designated cultural style. The second is structural style. Such a distinction helps comparatists to define the nature of various literary and artistic movements such as Romanticism, Modernism, Renaissance, etc. Heinrich Wölfflin was the first to recognize that besides an ideologically conditioned culture style, there is also an ideology-free structure style. The tradition, the translation problems is more of an aesthetic problem than a purely linguistic one. Literary translation is not just a replication of a text in another verbal system of science. It is a replication of an ordered subsystems of science within a language to another correspondingly ordered subsystem of science within a related language. Translation is not a transport position of significance or significating signs. Translation is rather an attempted revitalization of the original in another verbal space and verbal period. So, translation at once imitates the original and transcends it. The problem in translation study are therefore very much like those in literary history, whereas literary history has been classifying, describing, reviewing, though various ideological biases, the production or reception of literary works. Translation study so far has been mere analyzing the proximity between the original version and the revitalized version. And I'm done.
Okay.
Rohan.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, so one. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Devi started by saying that literary translation have the double exposure, work of literature and another one, work of translation, where the one who doesn't know the original language will look to the literature, and the one who knows the original language considers it as a set of translation. So, literature as a linguistic activity is supposed to renew the language resources by reading the community, and also it reveals the imagination and talent of the writer, evident in the pattern of language and the significance created. While creative literature got the ample attention by the critics and philosophers, literary translation had no privilege of having a well-developed philosophy of beauty in translation. Present studies of literary translation have this um, very prospective in nature, where they tell us what the translation should and should not do in order to arrive the satisfactory result in his enterprise. And we have recorded some of them. One was edited. He says that the translation must fully understand the sense, the meaning of the author, although he is at liberty to clarify obscurity. Second, the translation should have knowledge about the source language and the translated language. Third, the translation should avoid word-to-word renderings. Fourth, the translation should use forms of speech in common use. And fifth, the translation should choose and order words appropriately to produce the correct one. After half a century, Chapman postulated that the translation must avoid word-to-word rendering. He should attempt to reach the spirit of the original, and he should avoid overuse of translation. In 18th century, Alexander Fraser Tytler suggested that the translation should give a complete transcript of the idea of the original work, and the translation and manner of writing should be of the same character as of the original. The translation should have all the ease of the original composition. Um, on the other hand, observation by Steiner, Jacobs, and Nida classified that to the descriptive in nature, classificatory to the descriptive nature. Um, Bassett, in summary of Eugene Nida's typology, he says that translation is a scholar's activity where the preeminence of the source language text is assumed at the de facto, uh, over the translation language version. He also says that translation as a means of encouraging the intelligent reader to return to the source language original. Translation, he continues with that translation as a mean of helping the translated language reader to become equal to what called the contrived forgiveness in the translated language text. Translation as a means whereby the individual translator who sees himself like Aladdin in the enchanted world offers in his own pragmatic choice of translated language reader. He wound up by saying translation as a means through which the translation seeks to upgrade the status of the source language text because it perceived as being on lower cultural level. The mm, the post-structural thinkers in Europe, whom Jacques Derrida was one of the most important figures, have come up with different questions like what makes the act of translation a satisfactory act, and what are the various motivation behind the act of translation, and what makes translation literary translation literature too. So Derrida raised many fundamental questions about the absolute position occupied by the literary text in the traditional critical discourse. Derrida argues that each new instance of reading in the text is a different occasion to experience the absence of its meaning. When literature is viewed from Derrida's perspective, the received notion of absolute separation from the source language text to the translated language text in translation become debatable. Derrida writes that translation practices the difference between signified and signifier. Uh, and the difference is never pure. Translation is less so, and the notion of transformation must be substituted by the notion of translation. The idea of translation is an intertextual exercise has been further developed by the critics who follows Derrida. Gayatri Chakrabarti in Spivak, in her preface to her translation of Derrida's of Grammatology, drawing on Jeffrey Melham's essay on translation. She started her preface like, I begin this preface by informing my readers that Derrida admitted as a denied a preface by questioning the absolute repeatability of text. His theory would likewise admit as it denies translation by questioning the absolute privilege of the original. Translation is one version of intertextuality, and if there is no unique works, if as soon as a privilege concept word emerges, it might be given over the chain of substitution and to the common language. Um, Derrida's consideration and those of his followers um, towards granting literary translation the status that it deserves, that the status of literature in addition to that of the complicated translingual activity. She also added that Derrida has not tried to give a systematic theory of literary translation. His observation uh, also quoted one of his central assumptions is about the relationship between the sign and signified. Um, Also, in another page in the interview, Derrida comments that if expression is not simply and once for all separable, expressivity is in fact always already surpassed, whether one wishes or not, whether one knows it or not, in the extent to which what is called meaning is already thoroughly constituted by a tissue of difference. Another linguistic like Catford follows Derrida's line of thinking about the relation between meaning and the text should be the Western anxiety about the metaphysical exile from the original to be cured. I also say that the multilingual perspective strengthens linguistics in the post-colonial region than the adequate theory of translation. Devi continues says that for an Indian student of translation, these binding constraints won't matter up to an extent because Indian metaphysics is not haunted by the fear of exile from the absolute right. Indian sociology does provide a multilingual context to the literary study. The most remarkable representation in this combined linguistic view in India can be located in this Bhattacharya's exposition of the Spota theory in the first chapter in the monument. He says that since the phonetic manifestation is sequential, language expresses itself in the sequentially graded body. A relation between nada, which is the phonetic manifestation, and the spota, which is semantic realization, is like that between the reflection of something in the flowing water and the stream. A reflection which is of a steady object, but which echoes the moment of the stream. As just like the knowledge reflects its own nature as well as as the nature of the giver of the knowledge, so do the phonetic sign reflect their own forms as well as the form of the significance. Um, in the fifth portion, Devi started saying that the success of translation depends on the richness of diction and the flexibility of the structures in the translated language. Though this view is not correct, success of a translation depends on the history of the translation activity in the translated language. Um, it's possible and even appropriate to maintain that all the preceding translations from a given source language to the given translated language together determine the quality of every subsequent translation from the source language to the translated language. As example, A into language B is satisfactory. As an example, he give a passage from Bible, uh, which is John 3:16. For, for God so loved the world that he gave in his begotten Son, that whomsoever believed in him should not perish but have everlasting love. As the Bible is translated into 1,100 languages, however, the reach of diction in English language won't possible to accommodate comfortably when it's translated into other 1,100 languages. Um, Most of the terminology of Western literary criticism, to take another example, has been translated into the modern Indian languages in some operative form. But even the basic of the ancient Indian poetics have not yet been housed in English. The practice of translating criticism from English to Indian language is widespread, but the practice of translating criticism from Indian language to English has a poor history. Theories of translation can be formulated within the specific context of one-way communication between source language and the given translation language. Just as the tradition, translation in a language strengthens every work of translation. A new work of translation strengthens the translated language. The contribution to the translation language is made by creating a new subsystem within the translation language. As Bhalchandra Nimi points out in the excellent article in Marathi, every translated language translation strikes linguistic compromises between the source language and the translated language. Collectively, many translations create a convention of linguistic compromises, which then becomes a subsystem within the translated language. In the Indian context, literally translation can be divided majorly into three. First, those who interested in preserving the ancient literary heritage. Second, those who interested in westernizing Indian languages and literature. Third, those who interested in nationalizing literature in the modern Indian language. Translation tradition are full of instances of rendering this Sanskrit epics and other literature. Uh, Chineswari, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong, in Marathi is one of is an example where where these translations are made without any inhibition and they rarely maintained a word-to-word line for discipline. The category useful for the study of this translation is not the translation language and the source language, or the mother tongue and the other tongue. The poets and writers attempting uh, vernacular renderings of Sanskrit text treated both language as their own languages. In translation, translating the Sanskrit text, they sought to liberate the scriptures from the monopoly of restricted class of people. Um, Also, the translation become reorganized in the entire society. Um, no theory with an exclusively linguistic orientation can be adequate to understand the magnitude of translation activity in India. In the British powered India and the spread of British English education, a new value structure emerged in India. Um, at the time, everything British was considered to be hierarchically, inherently good, and the consequence of this colonial value scheme was an indiscriminate institutionalization of English literature. And during the century, it was very fashionable um, in India to translate all the century work of English literature. In that period, Shakespeare was translated as Waistcoat and Bunyan. And the basic idea of behind the indiscriminate translation activity, more translation from English will strengthen Indian languages. But that sounds completely out of tune with natural growth of that language. The subsystem of language within the translation operator comes to occupy the center stage. Therefore, the prose style in modern Indian language has acquired the inevitable texture and tone of translation language. They are less supple than what they need to be. The colonial legacy is so firmly rooted in the contemporary Indian literary culture that often we find Indians making a new claim that literary prose is positively and originally contribution made by the British to Indian culture. The purely linguistic neutral theory of this translation would be inadequate to understand the politically motivated colonial translation activity. British colonialism in India created a conflict between the cultural priority. Um, it created the desire of this rapid westernization and also created the tendency to revive the past culture. Um, in addition of these two tendencies, colonialism created a longing national unity. The three tendencies was westernization, revivalism, and nationalism. So at the end of the First World War, a large number of Indian soldiers had returned home after getting an exposure to the European culture, other than the British. Also, Mahatma Gandhi, up to an extent, has entered the political scene of India of a national awareness. Um, as a result, these changes was that Indian translation turned now to European literature as well as the literature in other Indian languages. How during these 3 decades of Gandhian freedom struggle, the interlingual exchange within the Indian languages multiplied. During the post-colonial decades, most Indian writers um, um, vie with each other to get their work translated into English. Getting translated into English has at present become a kind of status symbol for the writers in Indian languages. That translation is not politically innocent activity. Translation is not merely a linguistic activity. It is a cultural act. It is so that the nature of translation activity cannot simply universally uniform, such as the will allow formulate a single grand theory of translation. In a country having a tradition of housing numerous language at any region given time history, the culture that accept metamorphosis as a basic principle of existence and intelligent and appropriate theory of translation become one of the primary needs of Indian criticism. And he also says that not everything in the Western theory of translation is relevant to us, nor everything is useful. Uh, he concluded the discussion by quoting the excellent essay on translation by the Marathi poet, translator Dilip Chhitre, in the essay A Life on the Bridge. Chhitre writes like that: I have been walking in the haunted workshop, rattled and shaken by the spirits of other literature unknown to my ancestors. In fact, unknown spirit came to be my literature ancestors, clamorously for recognition. Europe has already haunted my house. A larger Indian tradition besides it too. And this tradition was sometimes perceived as such by the Europeans first. Even as a independent practicing poet, I live in the postmodern world transformed by translation. This is my predicament as a writer. I have to build a bridge within myself between India and Europe, or else I become a fragmented person. Here ends the essay, and now we are open to the queries and questions. And also, sir, I would like to take my leave because I'm having. Hello.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I would like to take my leave because I'm having this match today, finals. So I want to be there within
What do you have
2:30.
here? What do you have?
Nationals, nationals,
National of what?
Santosh Trophy selection, Santosh Trophy selections,
It's a which trophy? I didn't get
football,
you. Oh,
Santosh
so you are
Trophy.
going to participate.
Yes, sir.
It's a selection round.
Yes, sir. I'm representing my district, Rajkot.
Areva, very good. So all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. Yeah, anybody has some queries, doubts, if they are awake and listening to these presentations, then are there any queries or anything that you have observed that is interesting or not interesting about this essay? The presenters, what did you feel about this essay? What was your feeling, Richa and Sohan?
Hello, sir. Sir, am I
So what
audible?
was? Yeah, yeah.
Sir, I feel that as India is a diverse country, so I feel like there are no origins and endings as it changes so gradually, uh, and languages contains so many variations like and dialects, and also share a number of features. So often, and we speak so many mixed languages. Sometimes some languages we don't understand,
How many
and
languages do you speak, Richa?
sir, I speak only Hindi, Assamese, and English.
Okay. And
And others I
Hindi,
don't. Yeah, I understand Gujarati a little, but I don't speak it. It doesn't come out from my mouth fluently.
right. You understand Bangla?
Yes, sir, I understand.
Right. So, what was your observation? You and Sohan before he goes for his football. Uh, what was your response to
According to
this?
me, sir, I,
Hmm.
sir, I believe like we have directed our focus to India as a very fertile land in case of translation, where
Hmm.
there is no fear of this getting away of this original thing, where the Western culture or the Western literature was very adamant in the case of translation, where they come up with different criteria of translation, where India, as a country which is very multilingual and having different culture and different languages of any time, there is no this fear of going away from the word-to-word rendering or little bit away from the
Hmm.
original uh, original theme, where the theme says it all, but it can be revealed in a different way or different perspective.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
he says that India is a very fertile land in the case of translation and developing a translation theory, which I
Okay. Right. So what we will do is that you have your football uh, and selection round for football, and others have their exams at 3. So I think we can take a break now, and we'll discuss this paper tomorrow, this essay, because this is one of the most important essays in Indian translation studies, right? ITS, Indian Translation Studies, if that's the term you want to use, right? Okay. So let us stop for here, and others who are not who have not read this can read this and come, and we will have uh, a larger kind of discussion tomorrow, right? So all the best, Soham.
sure, sir.
Yes.
Don't wish me luck, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. क्या क्यों
Thank you,
नहीं?
sir.
Whenever I like, if someone wish me, I will be performing pathetic. I don't know why. I have this.
क्या क्या superstitions लेके घूमते हैं ये football
It just
players?
traumatizes me, sir. Every time. Every time. I
So
always ask
don't get
people
traumatized.
to pray for.
You should
I
traumatize
always
others.
say people that हार जाने के लिए प्रार्थना कर लेना भाई.
नहीं, you should be
Like this.
traumatizing others on the field. People should be afraid of you.
So I'm already injured, sir.
तो
Hamstring
you should
injury हो गया
injure
already.
others.
So I'm
दूसरे को
giving
injure
you the
करो,
try.
वो नहीं. चलो, see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
welcome.